Cosmo Foxtrot, a science fiction action-adventure. Prologue. Charlotte felt like she was going to die. Inside her dark cockpit, she held onto the throttle with her life. The space outside was blowing with hundreds of smart bombs, incendiary fuses, and mini nukes. The only thing that kept her safe was that her little one-man space fighter had armor that could withstand an indirect hit. There were many controls within her cockpit. Different colors littered the panels surrounding her. Angular thrusters, pitch navigators, weapon panels. Overhead, enemy fighters flew by. To her right, another trio of enemy fighters flew by. Some fired magnetic rounds that barely missed Charlotte's fighter. She had known that today was going to be a bad day. Back on the carrier, she had been served lamb chops and given a chance to write a letter to her family back on Mars, a signal that she was going to engage the enemy soon. More fighters flew by. Space was eerily silent. There was no sound, but all her electronics and senses were telling her she was in trouble. To her left, there were buttons that would ignite the worm space jump thrusters. They could only be used once, and they had already been used. Without a worm space jump thruster, she could only wait until her carrier group caught up to her. She was part of an advance force to fend off enemy starships and fighters attacking a friendly cruiser squadron. Then, just a minute ago, an enemy destroyer group caught up to them, alongside another enemy carrier group. Things were only getting worse by the second. Now there were 2 enemy carrier groups and an enemy destroyer group against a friendly carrier group and 32 advanced tactical fighters, including Charlotte's own fighter. Rounds of magnetic cannon fire passed by from behind, and Charlotte immediately pushed on her navigational throttle, forcing her fighter into a deep dive. The rounds continued firing past her, meaning that the enemy was fast and acute, just not accurate. If he were, she'd be dead already. Charlotte was a good pilot, so she caught on fast. She pushed her fighter into another deep dive, followed by another. Eventually, the rounds of cannon fire disappeared from behind. She was barely able to see the enemy fighter that had shot at her through her fighter's sensors. Through twists and turns, she paralleled the enemy fighter in 4 malicious spirals until she could finally obtain a targeting solution on him. She pressed the fire keys and her fighter shuttered as rounds of her own cannon fire streamed out into the space near the enemy fighter. She missed. All her rounds missed. For the enemy was fast. Suddenly, another round of enemy cannon fire streamed past horizontally, telling her that another enemy fighter was engaging her. Now, there were 2 fighters. Charlotte bit her tongue, and this time pulled on her throttle. She went into a fast spinning flip that angled her fighter along the same horizontal plane as the fighter that just shot at her. She had to do something fast, and drastic, because she knew that 2 enemy fighters against just herself, no matter how good she was, meant a very unlikely chance that she'd survive. So she angled her nose directly at the new enemy fighter and began a head-to-head engagement. Head-to-head engagements were the most difficult to perform. The slightest mistake would mean immediate death. But she had 2. Against 2, she had to kill 1 quickly or be killed. In slight milliseconds, almost superhuman to the average human non-pilot, she angled her cannons not at where the enemy was, but where the enemy would be. These were drastic decisions that her senses told her what the enemy would do. She had 10 milliseconds to guess. In those 10 milliseconds, the enemy fired off 13 rounds of magnetic cannon projectiles into her path. In those same 10 milliseconds, she did her best and fired off rounds of cannon projectiles at the enemy. In another several milliseconds, the enemy flew past her. Charlotte sucked in air as she awaited the impact of cannon fire on her weak armor, which never came. Then her instruments told her that the enemy fighter had dissolved into little pieces, meaning she had hit. Charlotte sighed in relief as tried to find the remaining fighter, wherever he was, using her instruments. There. She angled her nose at the enemy and fired, again. A minor hit, but dead on. The remaining enemy fired at her, too, causing sounds to rocket through her hull. She'd been hit, but not dead. The instruments to her right told her one of her weapon wings had been blown off. She climbed into another desperate spiral, causing her enemy to follow her. Then she maneuvered an excellent spin that allowed her to get firing solution on the enemy who had blankly walked into her trap. She fired, and the resulting explosion blinded her eyes. Seconds later, she found herself sitting within the cockpit, looking loosely as the pieces of debris flew past her. She was alive and well, for now. She angled her fighter towards another enemy wing and punched her thrusters towards it. The day of hell would continue unabated. Admiral Hill, commander of Cruiser Group 9, held tightly onto the railing as the hull of her flagship shuddered to the blasts of enemy nukes. Her flagship was tough. Its armor was the heaviest and best in the fleet, but even then it could only sustain so much. And today, it had sustained a lot. Down below, Men crowded with computers that operated her ship and her cruiser fleet. The 32 relief fighters that her superiors had assigned to her had led to another enemy carrier group into the engagement. The battle was in its heyday. The lights from above blinked on and off as her cruiser/flagship was shuttered. Currently, she used her hand to submit orders into one of the 3 computer consoles on her platform. A map to her right showed that her 19 cruisers were in the midst of engagement with an enemy destroyer group and 2 enemy carrier groups. The squadron of friendly fighters that had just arrived were falling one by one. There were too much enemies and not enough friendlies. Her priority targets had already been assigned and hit with her cruiser group's large magnetic railguns and missiles. The next wave of enemy fire caused one of her aft cruisers to explode. They were targeting her units as well. Her battle was just a portion of a larger engagement spanning several light years. The heaviest engagements between her side and the enemy was taking place in the Epsilon Eridani star system. She was only part of a flank force to draw enemy units away from that battle. Currently, the communication drones told her that things were not going well in Epsilon Eridani as well. Numerous losses and pale victories showed on her panels. Currently, her force was in the Deltan star system. Target this carrier group, she submitted orders into her computer. They were executed quickly, resulting in the redirection of friendly missile fire and large magnetic cannons at the newly assigned enemy. Her platform pounded and shook as another nuke hit dead-on. Everything in the ship clanged with the incoming hit. Something fell from the ceiling. Something large. Admiral Hill cried in pain as that something hit her. She cried, again as she hit the floor several feet below. "Ma'am, are you okay?" asked an ensign. "I'm all right," she said, clearly against what she felt. As she climbed back up to her platform, she whimpered as she saw the big gash on her shoulder. It was bleeding with metallic parts sticking into her skin. Her blue and white uniform around it was quickly turning red. But she had to continue the fight. It was her squadron's most desperate hour. "Ma'am. You need to see a medic." "Medic. Get back to your station," yelled Admiral Hill. She tried to stand up on her platform, but she fell. Everything turned black. She felt like she was fainting. Nearby, many lower-grade officers paused in their duties to help her up. She rescinded the help. "Admiral, perhaps it's a good idea to let the Vice Admiral take command," said a lieutenant, junior grade. "Perhaps," said Admiral Hill. She paused but shook her head. The battle was still in its heyday. It was absolutely necessary that she commanded all fleet forces in the area. Painstakingly, she managed to get back to her platform. As she stood, she felt another fainting spell, but managed to keep consciousness while the ship shuddered to another nuke hit. She surveyed all the elements in the battlefield. In the time that she was away from the platform, the enemy had advanced on 3 points. The friendly tactical fighters had lost 3 and were down to 24 surviving. What the enemy was trying to do, she couldn't understand. She tried to deduce what their strategy was. From that, she could change or maintain her strategy, which was priority targeting the enemy's carriers. Without carriers, their fighters had no place to restock. Enemy fighters were currently engaging both friendly fighters and friendly cruisers. Enemy destroyers were currently fighting the entire friendly cruiser line. Friendly fighters were engaging enemy fighters only, and friend cruisers were targeting enemy carriers only. The problem was that as things were going, the entire friendly fighter force would be destroyed by the sheer numbers of enemy fighters. And the entire friendly cruiser line would be demolished by enemy destroyers. Suddenly, another of her cruisers exploded in her display monitors. Admiral Hill had to do something drastic. Without friendly cruisers, the backbone of her entire force would be wiped out. So she inputted orders telling the friendly fighters to start attacking the enemy destroyers. This would deplete their bombs, but it was necessary. That meant enemy fighters would be free to engage whatever they wanted, whether that was to chase the friendly fighters or to attack the friendly cruisers. But it had to be done. The call line beeped within Charlotte's helmet. "Orders from the top," said her familiar wing commander's voice. "Your new orders are to attack destroyers F and Y here and here." New targets were highlighted within the navigational display above her. "What about the fighters?" "The Admiral says she'll worry about the fighters. You just attack the destroyers, copy?" "Copy," said Charlotte. Within the mere safety of the panels of her cockpit, Charlotte frowned. The day couldn't get any worse. To attack enemy destroyers with just the fighter numbers they had was a bit on the side of suicide. Charlotte didn't know what the Admiral at the top was thinking. But she shrugged. Orders were orders. On the navigational display, she saw how many of her wingmates were disengaging their dogfights with enemy fighters and heading towards the enemy destroyers in unison. She lined her fighter with them and tried her best to not separate herself from the rest. if she wanted to survive. For a minute, nothing happened. No engagements occurred that worried her inside her cockpit. Then the space around her exploded with flak bombs. Inside her cockpit, she could hear as the armor of her fighter was pecked with constant hits from flak fragments. Inside, she angled her fighter on a course towards Destroyer F, all the while trying to keep her throttle steady amidst the flak hitting her outside. Then, warning lights to her left beeped on the damage control panel. It said that one of her weapon wings was disabled. She only had 2 of the original 4 wings left. It also said that her armor was being shredded. That's just great, thought Charlotte. Soon, not even her armor could protect her. She started zigzagging her fighter to counter the flak being shot at her. As she entered the weapon's range of the destroyers, Charlotte pressed on the fire button, enabling her magnetic cannons to fire on the destroyers. The hulls of the destroyers were pecked by hits, but they were dense, so the hits, Charlotte felt, did very little damage. Nevertheless, she continued aiming and firing at the destroyers every chance she could get, all the while coming into closer range so she could release her bombs. As she got closer, the flak became more accurate. The damage panel to her left beeped with warning lights as multiple parts of her fighter was hit by flak fragments. When she finally got within bombing range, she pressed a button at the top of her cockpit to release her bombs. They fell away, on a collision course with Destroyer F. At her speed, Charlotte could not simply turn around and leave. She had to fly past the destroyer targets. That meant pumping full speed and going faster than the bombs that were arriving from behind her. That also meant becoming dangerously close to the destroyer. She pressed hard on the thrusters and her fighter accelerated towards the destroyers at an angle that hopefully would not impact the destroyers. The bombs behind her followed, but at an angle that would hit the destroyers. Now, she was alarmingly fast, and the flak intensified. The enemy destroyer loomed big in front of her, growing bigger as the seconds passed. Then, she finally passed by. Seconds later, her bombs reached the target and gigantic explosion occurred behind her. Her panel read that the explosion had caused a huge hole into Destroyer F, and now the destroyer was venting atmosphere. Numerous explosions from bombs released by Charlotte's wingmates also occurred on the sensor panels. Charlotte at last was free, and at her speed she quickly escaped the range of the destroyer's flak guns. The hull of her flagship pounded with hits from enemy fighters. Admiral Hill knew that because she had ordered her fighters to disengage the enemy's fighters, the enemy was free to use their fighters to attack her cruisers. Admiral Hill was in trouble, because those attacks, although small, were in unison, and in numbers they did terrible damage to her cruiser line. But, good things did happen. The fighters that she had sent to bomb the enemy destroyers had devastated 6 destroyers, and had temporarily halted the push from the rest. However, 4 of her cruisers had been bombed by enemy fighters, and were now being close to dead. Moreover, a squadron of enemy fighters had passed through her flak screens and were now pounding at her own flagship, in which she was centered. Her cruiser squadron could not repel the enemy fighters. And it would be a long time before friendly fighters would arrive back to help defend her cruiser line. But there was nothing she could do. She continued ordering the flak to be fired at the enemy fighters. Her fleet's magnetic railguns continued raining down at enemy destroyers. Having depleted her fleet's missile supply, her missile launchers were idle. Then, something big hit her flagship. A huge explosion sounded across the hull and everybody within the command center were sent flying. Admiral Hill fell off her platform once again, this time crashing into a computer module. In her mind's eye, she could imagine a terrible nuke, big and deadly, having hit her flagship. That's what it must have been. The only other thing that terrorized her was the pain of crashing into something metallic. This time, there were no voices to confront her. Everyone had been sent flying. She could hear people screaming. Others were moaning. The smell of blood and fire burned inside the flagship's command center. Amazingly, Admiral Hill was able to return to her platform. On her monitors, her flagship had indeed been hit with a carefully aimed nuke. It was now venting atmosphere in its vulnerable ventral sections. These were portions of her flagship that she had carefully kept away from enemy destroyers. Inside, Admiral Hill knew it was time to call abandon ship. She picked up the microphone and spoke to the entire ship. Abandon ship. Abandon ship. All crew to escape hatches. Amidst another explosion, Admiral Hill climbed off the platform and headed towards the exits from the command center as another explosion sent crew members flying. The road to the escape pods were filled with wounded crewmen. The narrow hallways of her cruiser were tainted with smeared blood. Nobody bothered to notice her, anymore. For everyone was fleeing. As Admiral of the fleet, she was no longer in control of the situation. It took minutes for her to get into an escape pod that was nearly full. She was the last one in. A scared crew member saw her and left an open spot for her to sit. Then the hatch was closed, and the release button on the escape pod was pressed. Suddenly, the sound of being jettisoned into space and the feeling sudden acceleration and being slammed into the seats was felt. For a while, the noise of the warhead slamming into the cruiser disappeared. Space was silent. It carried no sound. Then a bright explosion occurred. Admiral Hill knew it was the end of her flagship/cruiser. The escape pod continued floating in space, twisting, completely vulnerable. Admiral Hill wondered if she would get out of this situation alive. Charlotte's fighter zoomed through space at 300,000 miles per hour. Even then, her speed was still increasing. Her thrusters were at full. Inside, Charlotte felt no turbulence, as space had no atmosphere. All was silent except for the routine beeping of instruments and the sound of her heart breathing. The information on her navigational panel above her told her that the Admiral's ship had been destroyed. Thus, there was no one in charge of the friendly forces in the system. It seemed as if everyone was fending for themselves. A beeping in her helmet occurred. "Yes?" said Charlotte. "See those escape pods?" said her flight commander's voice. "The enemy fighters are picking them off. Help me defend them. There are humans in there." "Yes, sir." Charlotte pressed on the throttle and accelerated her fighter towards the direction where enemy fighters and escape pods had been highlighted in her navigational panel. It looked like she was in for another dogfight. As she accelerated through space, one of the escape pods highlighted on top was blown to pieces. "Help us!" cried terrified voices in her communication channel. "I'm coming," said Charlotte. As she came closer and closer, she could see the debris from the Admiral's flagship. Suffocated personnel were in the debris. She tried her best to avoid colliding with it, but some pecked her armor, creating sounds in her cockpit. As she came closer to the escape pods, she could pick out individual enemy fighters. They were shooting at the escape pods. Charlotte pressed the trigger on her magnetic cannons. Lobs of cannon fire came close the enemy fighters, taking their attention off the escape pods. 3 of them redirected their attention to her and went after her. Charlotte's breathing quickened inside the dark cockpit. "My lucky day," she said. Streams of enemy fire lobbed at her from her front to her back. She tilted her fighter's nose at one of the enemy fighters and pressed the trigger. In slight milliseconds, she exchanged fire with 3 enemy fighters. But at the speed she was going, it was much too fast to accurately target anyone or be accurately targeted. As a result, the 3 enemy fighters zoomed past her. Inside, she pulled on the throttle, which twisted her fighter around. She then slammed on the thrusters, decelerating her vehicle to the inertial frame of the 3 bogies. This took time. A lot of time, but eventually it was done. Lobs of enemy magnetic cannon rounds flew past her. Once again, she was in a head-to-head collision course with the enemy. Quickly targeted one of the fighters and fired her own rounds. The fighter was hit, but nothing happened as it flew past her. It seemed the enemy fighter's armor absorbed the damage. "Damn," she thought. What were these fighters? These were not normal fighters. They had much more armor than the ones she had fought earlier. She tilted her fighter to a side and accelerated into a loop. The 3 enemy fighters did the same. Each coming for another pass or trying to maneuver into position to fire, again. Eventually, she was once again in a head-to-head confrontation. Lobs of enemy fire streaked past her, some hit her armor, sending vibrations throughout her cockpit. She fired at the enemy, too, and with amazing accuracy. But none of the fighters showed any hint of being damaged from her cannon rounds. They flew past her from front to back, once again. This time, she braked her fighter, pulled it into an acceleration at a much higher curve. This time, she would try to follow one of the enemy fighters from behind. If their front armor was this tough, she wondered if the back armor was the same. The enemy fighter saw this and twisted away from her. She matched the twist. The 2 other enemy fighters tried to follow from behind her, but she was too agile. Slowly, through many twists and turns, she reached into position. She pressed on the trigger and streams of magnetic rounds fired past her. They hit. The enemy fighter jittered, then turned to a side and exploded. Charlotte sighed. The armor at their backs were weak, so she abruptly twisted into another turn to follow another enemy fighter from the back. The other fighter did twists and turns, but she was much too agile. Her senses and reactions were too acute for the enemy fighter. Eventually, she was in position, and fired into the back of the other fighter. It exploded. One left, she thought. Suddenly, the remaining fighter braked, then accelerated into the ranks of 3 destroyers. 3 enemy destroyers. Oh, shit. Suddenly, the space around her exploded in multiple flak screens. Her fighter was peppered with dozens of hits. Her armor was wearing thin. Charlotte had to think fast. There was only one option that could save her. She tilted her fighter towards the destroyers and accelerated at max thrusters. As she slipped into extreme close range of an enemy destroyer, she then braked and accelerated around the destroyer. She was in such close range that the other destroyers could not fire flak at her without causing damage to their own destroyer, and she was using the enemy destroyer to block herself from other destroyers. Then, her navigational panel blinked. Dozens of enemy fighters showed up on her navigational panel. Where had they come from? And then she saw an enemy carrier group. Oh, dear God! She thought. Waves of enemy fighters would arrive any minute, and there was nothing she could do. If she maneuvered out of range of the fighters, she would be hit by the destroyer's flak screens. Help was nowhere to be found. She linked with her commander. "Commander, what do we do?" "Do anything you can," he said, then the signal abruptly ended. She continued maneuvering around the enemy destroyer at close range. Minutes passed. Then the enemy fighters were within range and began following her as she encircled the enemy destroyer. They fired bursts of cannon fire towards her, and Charlotte could barely move out of its way. But there was so many. Even with her agile twisting and turning, she was hit. Damage panel to her left reads severe damage to her fighter. She wouldn't last another hit or two. She had to do something. She made a break for it. She tilted her fighter to a place where there were no enemies, fully knowing that the enemy fighters would soon follow. Then accelerated at max thrusters. The enemy fighters from behind followed her. Then space around her exploded in flak screens from multiple capital ships. But they didn't come from the enemy. Charlotte checked her navigational panel and it beeped with the sudden jump signatures of friendly destroyer squadrons. Furthermore, a friendly carrier jumped into space near her and immediately began launching friendly fighters. The enemy fighters chasing her were hit with flak and they scrambled away towards newer targets. The enemy destroyers and friendly destroyers began exchanging cannon rounds. Her helmet beeped with an incoming message: "To all friendly units in the Delton system, you are to be reassigned new targets. Help has arrived." Thank God, thought Charlotte. She followed her new targeting assignments. For the first time, she was aware of her heavy breathing, and the amount of sweat she had perspired. Chapter 1. The Epsilon Eridani War, the fourth war since the first human-alien contact, and the fifth major conflict involving humans in the century, had begun when aliens called the Hybrid had claimed the Epsilon Eridani system as theirs. Geographically, the system was located deep within the human territories, although there were no formal political borders. Humans had just begun exploring their side of the Orion Arm, and were only centuries since beginning their first FTL steps into unknown territory. The alien race known as the Hybrid was actually two races, both malicious, wanting control of all territories within their reach. They had only begun exploring in FTL a millennium before. The Epsilon Eridani system, in particular, held incredible amounts of dark matter, embedded within the Eridani star. Both humans and aliens used dark matter to power their star drives and weapon systems. And so the stage was set for a rash military conflict. Humans had already colonized the system a century earlier, but due to the rapidly expanding and shifting borders of the Hybrid Dominion, the system became designated as Hybrid Domain. In the first year of combat, 13 million lives of human colonists were lost in the Epsilon Eridani star system. 400,000 military fatalities occurred on the human side. The Hybrid Dominion, having attacked first, had the upper hand, and thus suffered much less casualties. In the second year of combat, another million human colonists' lives were lost, followed by a failed offensive to drive the Hybrid out of the system. In the third year, which is the current year, the enemy launched a new offensive. It started small at first. The Hybrid Domain attacked a minor moon on the sixth planet in system. But that turned into a major point in which the enemy launched attacks on heavily fortified human positions. The minor moon, part of a larger planet, had eventually arrived through its planet's orbit into human territories within the system. In particular, the third planet called Celestial was a largely human-populated domain. Celestial suffered heavy losses to the Hybrid through a 20-day battle known as the Hedge, in which the orbit of Celestial came very close to the orbit of the Hybrid-confiscated moon. Due to planetary bombardment, Celestial's surface population was wiped out, except for those who lived deep underground. During the latter phases of the alien offensive, the surfaces of many rocky planets were overtaken by Hybrid ground forces. With most of the remaining human population trapped underground within Celestial and several other rocky planets in the Epsilon Eridani system, humanity's Central Naval Command in Tau Ceti, having long given up trying to obtain permanent control of Epsilon Eridani, decided it was time to launch a brief counteroffensive to relieve its trapped personnel. And thus, another major battle in Epsilon Eridani was set. Charlotte was happy. The large room within Admiral Hill's new flagship was brightly lit. There was much of the Admiral's command staff in the room. Charlotte wore a stiff uniform made for formal moments. She could see several officers higher than her standing as she walked up the podium for her award. And next is Charlotte Ty. She is to be awarded the Ace of Stars, for 17 kills in combat. She walked up to applause. Admiral Hill, a red-haired lady, held a golden star the size of a walnut. She pinned it to her breast. "Thank you, ma'am." The Admiral smiled back. As a woman, Charlotte could sense that the Admiral had much deeper fears. As Charlotte returned to her seat, the Admiral spoke, "And now let us return to the situation on hand." The room darkened a little, and a large projection on top of Charlotte emerged. Charlotte had to bend her neck to view it. The room silenced. "This is our current location within the Deltan system. We were sent here to distract and draw enemy forces from the major battle happening in the Epsilon Eridani system, where the majority of all our forces are currently engaging the enemy. As of 0800 hours, by communication drone, we have received that our forces in the Epsilon Eridani system are suffering major losses. As of result, we have been ordered to head directly to that system. As of result, Flight Commander Ty, you are now promoted to lead a squadron of fighters." Charlotte nodded in understanding. Her previous flight commander had lost his life in battle, and so Charlotte was promoted to fill him. He wasn't the only loss. Her squadron of 32 fighters had diminished to 20, but had been refilled by newer pilots back to 32. The Admiral continued speaking to new reassignments. Eventually, she was done. She stared at Charlotte, and said, "Flight Commander Dawson, how do you feel about your new responsibilities?" Charlotte stammered. "I will do my best, ma'am." The Admiral paused. "Good, because we will need our best. You must do what you did against the enemy in the Deltan system, you understand? You will be leading our fighters into battle." "Yes, ma'am," said Charlotte. "In that case, this meeting is dismissed. You will all receive new instructions and mission briefs by 0900 hours. Good luck and may God keep you safe." The lights brightened within the room and many people left their seats and headed to the door. As Charlotte walked among them, she slightly saw Admiral Hill eye her with curiosity, and then turned around to leave. Admiral Hill's next steps fell short. Someone nearby had to help her get up. It was obvious she had taken serious injuries. Charlotte walked a route that would return her to her bunk within a carrier ship. Admiral Hill sat within the medical chambers of her new flagship cruiser. The room was blatantly white and brightly lit. A male nurse monitored her health signs and wrote on an electronic notepad. "Am I good to go?" "Not yet, ma'am," said the nurse. Admiral Hill sighed. She was heavily worried. She had tried to lighten the room's morale during her speech, but even someone like Jennifer Hill could see that there existed darker worries underneath. There was something deadly in knowing that the main force in Epsilon Eridani needing help. The doctor came into the room. The nurse left. "You're good to go, ma'am. Remember, your injuries have not been fully healed. Don't meddle with the stripes, understand?" "Yes. Thank you," said Admiral Hill as she headed to her new bridge. Mirabelle was firing. Inside the tunnels deep underground in a rocky moon called Arendis, in the Epsilon Eridani system, she and her human comrades were constantly waging war with the spider-like hybrids. The aliens were a menace to fight in the tunnels. One variant had 8 limbs, while another had 6. They used their limbs cleverly. Oftentimes, what was difficult for a human was easy for a hybrid. As a result, they were able to maneuver their forces around and flank humans' positions. It was desperate within those tunnels, and troopers like Mirabelle always found themselves fighting one-sided battles against a superior enemy that could navigate naturally within that environment. Mirabelle breathed heavily in her infantry suit. It was padded tremendously with carbon armor, the same that made diamonds. To that extent, it fitted closely with her body. It was heavy, but the motors within the suit, which took a certain amount of time to get used to, made moving easy. For her primary weapon, she held onto a laser rifle. Every trooper also carried a projectile-based sidearm that was centuries old in design. She gripped her rifle tightly, while information that was pouring into her sensor helmet was displayed inches in front of her eyes. Suddenly, there was movement. The sensors within her helmet beeped with excitement. She slowed her movements, and crouched. She eyed as the tunnel walls began to break slowly, letting whatever that was inside it to come through. Suddenly, her sensors highlighted the portion as green, meaning it was a friendly signature. Mirabelle let loose a sigh and loosened her grip on her rifle. The man that dug out from the tunnel wall was also in diamond armor. He waved at her as he found equal footing. Then the wall above him crumbled and a long alien limb swung through and struck the trooper, flipping him aside. The next limb stabbed at the trooper's helmet, crashing into and breaking a hole. The trooper's body acted like it was struck by lightning then loosened. Mirabelle fired. Her laser beam etched through space and burned holes into the insect-like limbs. An insect-like screech could be heard throughout the tunnels. Suddenly, the place began trembling. The sensors of her helmet buzzed with activity. Tremendous activity. Walls above her and behind her began crumbling. Insect-like limbs dug their way out. Mirabelle stood up and began running. "This is Gamma 1 reporting numerous bogey activity, Roger," she said into her helmet. "Stand by, Gamma 1." She didn't understand what standby meant. Did headquarters just ordered her to hold her position? Against numerous bogeys? Say, again, base? A pause. She could hear the walls crumbling and numerous red activity being highlighted. "Stand your position, Gamma 1." Mirabelle turned around and looked at all the red signatures crawling through the tunnels that she had just vacated. There was only one thing she could do. She hid behind a rock and fired at all the red. Insect-like screeching could be heard, followed by dust. Her helmet expertly identified targets despite the dust. Mirabelle kept firing, but there was so many. They fired their own weapons, too. Beams of laser etched on the walls around her, carving hot white dots into the rocks. Some burned their way into her armor, but missed her flesh. Mirabelle continued firing. Her armor was taking a pounding. But if one of those laser beams hit her helmet, she knew she would be doomed. Suddenly, her hind sensors blared with activity. Something was happening to walls behind her. She leapt, using the motors of her suit, to another spot, just as a huge limb appeared right behind her. Mirabelle held out her arm. It slashed into her armor, sending ripples of shock throughout her body. Mirabelle never hit her intended destination. Instead, she flew across the room and into the entrance where she had previously been firing. Her helmet lights blared against the ceiling as she lay on her back, temporarily dazzled. "Get up." Some voice within her told her to get up. She pulled herself into a sitting position, then onto all fours. She looked around on the ground for her rifle. She reached for it. Suddenly, something big slashed its limbs into the rifle, breaking it. She looked up, at the eyes of a six-limbed monster twice her size. It drooled thick black mucus that found its way onto the ground. It burned the ground, like acid. It then raised its two frontal limbs like cutting weapons and was about to slice into Mirabelle. Mirabelle pushed on the floor and her suit leapt her backwards, just as the cutting limbs nearly chopped her head off. She was hit somewhere on her helmet. The information screens that were displayed inches in front of her suddenly turned black. Her helmet had broke. Mirabelle tried to stand up. Amazingly, she was able to. She started running. Where? Anywhere. She couldn't stay in the same position. The screeching sounds were all around her. Some got very close. She ran through corridors of tunnels. The screeching was close behind her. Eventually, she ran into a wall. The collision sent her on her back, dazzled. The screeching came very close, almost above her. Exactly above her. Acid poured onto her suit. Through the hole in her helmet, she could see terrible dark limbs. Then a flash of white light burned its way into alien above her. Several other flashes of white light also dove their way into the thick exoskeleton. The screeching became monstrous. Suddenly, the space around her exploded with bombs bursting randomly. Laser beams burst through space and into the flesh of aliens. Laser beams from alien sidearms burst into the armor of human gunners. Mirabelle was only aware of one thing. She couldn't get up. If she did, she'd get shot. And also her heavy breathing. She crept slowly away from all the shooting, then took off her non-functioning helmet. She couldn't see. By the time it came off, the shooting was over. The alien screeching died down in the distance. Mirabelle took deep puffs through her gas mask, and saw several human forms in thick carbon armor waving at her. Chapter 2. Admiral Gunter, head of humanity's first fleet, watched as thousands of missiles flew through space. The missiles, upon impacting their targets, drew large nuclear explosions. He saw how his fleet and the enemy fleet exchanged fire in the Epsilon Eridani system. His fleet was currently positioned in one corner of the system, near the eighth outer planet. He witnessed the enemy launch waves after waves of offensives against human positions near the eighth outer planet. They attacked through magnetic cannons that hurled large metallic projectiles into the hulls of ships. Throughout the battle, humanity's forces were able to repel the hybrid waves, but at terrible losses. Wave after wave, the hybrid released often suicide forces that almost never surrendered. At the moment, there was nothing Admiral Gunter, sitting high on his admiral's platform in the battleship Heater, could do. His orders from Tau Ceti were to keep a beachhead until friendly units arrived from Delton. These were units commanded by a friend of his, Admiral Hill. He watched and watched as missiles exchanged between the two sides. Fires broke out in some of his starships. Admiral Gunter carefully ordered these starships to retreat behind the main fleet's lines through his computer. He also ordered newer, fresher ships to replace their positions. Huge magnetic cannon rounds continued to fire between the two fleets. "Sir," said the Hater's captain below, "we've sustained damage in our starboard cannons." "Evacuate all personnel," said Admiral Gunter. "Yes, sir." The captain below began barking orders to men sitting in front of computer screens that managed Hater's operations. Lights within the flagship continued to blink off as it was being hit. Gunter watched his computer screen of all the forces within the system. The enemy continued to send units upon units into the system. And just as he predicted, once again a new wave emerged from wormspace on the other side and began heading towards human positions. Although his job was to rescue humans underground in the 3 inner rocky planetoids, there was nothing he could currently. The enemy was too much. As the new wave came closer, Admiral Gunter gasped. It was larger than the ones previously, showed on his monitors. There were thousands of enemy starships. Gunter dropped his teacup and it shattered several levels below. No one was injured. Gunter considered his options. He couldn't leave. Thus, he decided to reorganize his fleet's battered lines in preparation for the new enemy offensive. There wasn't a lot left after 6 waves, but he had to make do. He aligned his starships in semi-spherical order. He also put the damaged starships in the rear, and kept the center of his semi-sphere relatively dense. It was the best he could do. He inputted the orders. On screen, he saw as his forces began to execute his commands. It took half an hour. In that time, the massive enemy wave was almost on them. Then, 3, 2, 1. The hull of Hater shuddered to the impact of enemy missiles. Alert! More enemy missiles incoming. Magnetic particle rounds incoming. All hands. Prepare for impact, cried the captain below. Launch all fighters. Launch all missiles. Fire cannon rounds at will, yelled Admiral Gunter. Suddenly, the space between the two fleets was becoming traversed by cannon rounds and missiles. For minutes, the two fleets exchanged fire. Numerous explosions occurred within both fleets. The ships in front of both fleets were utterly annihilated. Upon annihilation, the ships in the reserve took their places. But the human fleet was staggering. There simply just wasn't enough, thought Admiral Gunter, to repel this last attack. He thought of retreating, and the dishonor he would get from high command. He was just about to order it when a lieutenant below shouted, "Incoming cannon fire!" Suddenly, the battleship exploded with direct hits to its armor. Although its armor was tough, there was just too much enemy fire. "Primary hull failing," yelled a lieutenant. "Secondary hull failing." Suddenly, a huge bending sound emerged from deep inside. The bridge seemed to bend, then fires emerged from the tiers in the room. Fireballs engulfed the crew below. Flames spun their webs across the entire room. Admiral Gunter never gave the retreat command. He was burned alive. Charlotte had been bragging in the cafeterias on her carrier. She had been bragging a lot. But there was no one to stop her. For all she knew, she was the authority beside the admirals and their staff. On a couch, she looked at the ceiling of her room and the low lighting she had set, and sighed. 17 kills. 4 of them head-on. All captured on her flight data recorder. It was hard not to brag. Not bad for a kid who came from the Mars under projects. She wasn't like all the other pilots who came from rich surface homes. She had lived deep underneath, in low-grade efficiency apartments all her childhood. When she had aced her high school exams, she had been guaranteed a high stable income, but instead had opted for Mar Military Academy, deep within the surface of Valles Marineris, the largest canyon in the solar system, home of 200,000 cadets from the entire planet, and later on, to the elite military flight academy on Mons Olympus. There, she excelled in her studies and even graduated a year early, having taken more classes per semester than normal. The room she was in was bigger than the bunked room made for most pilots, but it was still tremendously smaller than say an admiral's quarters. Still, 17 kills was 17 kills. It was enough to tell her children if she ever had any. Not that she was planning any anytime soon. Suddenly, her couch shuddered. It wasn't just the couch, it was the entire room. Everything shuddered. That only happened when the ship was entering and exiting wormspace. And since all the ships in the fleet had already entered wormspace, it could only mean they were exiting. But why? It was so early. They could not possibly be at Epsilon Eridani, yet. She stood up, walked to the exit. The door opened. She peered out. The narrow hallways was buzzing with random crewmen walking by. The walls were black and iron. The lights shone from fixtures spread evenly in each direction. "What's going on?" she asked to a passing crewman. "Beats me, ma'am." The man peered at Charlotte, looking dazzled, blushed, then left. The first thing she thought of doing was to head to the briefing room. As flight commander, she had rights to know about the situation at hand. But as she exited, she noticed she was still in her briefs. She went back into her quarters and changed into her uniform, then sprinted to the command room on the carrier. When she entered the command room, the first thing she saw was the carrier captain's grim expression. The command room was not very large. It had monitors on all sides. Men worked on the stations surrounding the central console where the captain sat. Some sat, others stood. The captain, a well-cropped man in his late 40s, eyed Charlotte. "What's going on?" asked Charlotte. "Bad news, ma'am. Our fleet at Epsilon Eridani were utterly destroyed. They took too many casualties and lost numerous ships. Are we surrendering the system?" Apparently. A flat-screened map of three-dimensional space showed numerous friendly ships heading in the opposite direction in which Charlotte's carrier had been heading. A lieutenant said, "We're receiving orders from Admiral Hill. We are to escort the remnants of the main fleet back to the Deltan system." "I see," said the captain. "Helmsman, bring us about and prepare to wormspace jump towards where we previously were in the Deltan system." Then, he turned to Charlotte, "You can head back to your cabin, ma'am. It'll be a while before we get there." Chapter 3. Admiral Hill was distraught. Inside the bridge of the battleship Excalibur, she wrestled her hands with the railings of her platform. As the highest-ranking admiral in charge of both fleets, the one retreating Epsilon Eridani and the one that had been heading there, since the death of Admiral Gunter, Hill was in an uneasy position. Mission strategy was reserved to the admirals, but strategy such as the deployment of a fleet to a system was still reserved for high command back on Tau Ceti. At the moment, she had to retreat back to Deltan and submit communication drones to high command and await their orders. In the meantime, she fumbled with how to place her forces in the Deltan system. Her austere features, grim in the reddish light of her computer screens, reflected her quarrel. The computer screens were red because she was examining the latest reports of the battle that had occurred at Epsilon Eridani. Red was the typical color of enemy forces. There was a lot of red. In particular, she wanted to know how the enemy had routed all the friendly forces. She wanted to know why the friendly forces didn't react properly, or if they did, why they had still been obliterated. She replayed the battle in front of her, and then in her mind. The enemy had launched waves. The human ships, under Admiral Gunter, were in a typical semi-spherical formation to receive these waves. The first 5 waves were utterly annihilated, but at extreme cost to the human ships. Gunter lost about half of his ships and fighters. Then the 6th wave, the largest so far, worms-paced into the system and headed towards the first fleet. Gunter, as usual, realigned his remaining ships into semi-spherical position. Then the enemy entered firing range. Both fleets exchanged fire. Then somehow ships within the semi-sphere began wandering out of position, then Admiral Gunter's flagship blew, then the semi-sphere collapsed. And then, a rout. Once that begun, all ships began to retreat away from the system. The inner planets were once again in enemy hands. All the people underground in those planets were still trapped. That was what had happened. Admiral Hill wondered what she would have done, if she had been command of the First Fleet. She kept thinking about it, atop her admiral's platform. There was nothing she could have done differently. The enemy just had too many starships, and they overpowered the human fleet before her reinforcements could arrive. But, since it was likely that her fleet would have to face a larger enemy fleet just the same, Admiral had to think of something to counter that, or she would suffer the same fate. She thought about it long and hard. Inside the dark corridor where Mirabelle and many others slept, the dust sprang loose to the tremors of bombs above. Mirabelle couldn't believe it. The First Fleet had lost and now everyone trapped in the underground tunnels would remain trapped forever. How long could the humans survive deep underground? In terms of oxygen, there was nearly an infinite amount of oxygen trapped within the underground rocks. In terms of energy, humans had a limited amount of dark matter. As long as they weren't collecting them, they were running out of them. But it would be years before they'd run out. Most likely, they would all be killed in fights in the tunnels, before they ran out of energy. So that was her fate, thought Mirabelle. "I will die a lonely death," she whispered, deep within a rocky planet. "But I will die fighting." She clung to her rifle and armor and continued sleeping to the detonations above. The Epsilon Eridani excursion was a failure. Humanity's forces had been pushed back before they could rescue their trapped personnel. In the next 8 days, personnel underground continued fighting, but with low morale, many gave up. Others fought to exhaustion. Others still, like Mirabelle, continued fighting in the hopes that one day they would be rescued. But the hybrid wasn't just content with controlling Epsilon Eridani. It took only a week for the hybrid forces in the system to mobilize to invade Delton, where humanity's second and remnants of the beaten First Fleet were waiting their orders from High Command in Tau Ceti. The war between humanity and the hybrids was no longer a border conflict centering on resources. The hybrid had extended that. It was now a much larger war, crossing all territories of humanity. What did they want? What were they after? These were all questions in Admiral Hill's mind. Admiral Hill, weary on top of her platform in the Excalibur's bridge, stared at her computer map of all combatants in the battlefield. It was nerve-wracking, to be sure. The reply from Tau Ceti had been to make a necessary stand at Delton, where necessary was open to interpretation. Jennifer Hill believed that it meant that she should make a tough stand, but if the situation became too tough or if she thought she would suffer too much losses, she ought to retreat. The battle map was like this: the enemy fleet, having entered the Delton system less than a day ago, had taken orbit around the 7th planet, a gas giant. The 1st and 2nd human fleets were stationed around the 3rd planet. So far, minute forces from each side had begun battling, and losses were few. Enemy forces comprised of 13 destroyer squadrons, comprising of 100 each, 20 frigate squadrons, comprising of 50 each, 3 battleship squadrons, comprising of 20 each, and 4 carrier groups, comprising of 10 each. Overall fleet strength, 2,400 starships and, as far as Jennifer Hill could calculate, 1 million troops, in which the larger ship classes could hold as much as 5,000 each, while the smaller ones like frigates could hold 200 each. Friendly forces in the system comprised of 10 destroyer squadrons, 80 each, 20 frigate squadrons, 60 each, 4 battleship squadrons, 12 each, and 10 carrier groups, 10 each. Overall fleet strength, 2,148 starships with exactly 1,024,589 people manning them. The larger battleships could require as much as 6,000 people to man all positions. Frigates were about 200 each. A single tactical fighter was piloted by 1 person, while a reinforced fighter was piloted by 2. But the enemy was just massing up. Within the past day, more enemy units arrived on the scene of the future battle, and it didn't seem it would let up any time soon. Jennifer calculated that she could face a force of over 3,000 starships, if she included the ones coming from the hybrid's home system. Earth, on the other hand, could only supply 200 new starships, since their main dark matter source had been taken over. Admiral Hill leaned against her computer. The enemy was just waiting to mass up. When they did, they would attack. Admiral Hill had to plan on something right now. She would begin the first strike, while the numbers were still evenly matched. For next several hours, she sat atop her platform overlooking the entire bridge of the Excalibur. She ran several ideas through her mind about what she ought to do next. She examined these ideas thoroughly, weeding out the ones with likely bad outcomes. In the end, she decided that her best course, before the hybrids became too large, was to attack using a cone formation. Battleships on the tip to take in most of the damage. Destroyers behind on the surface of the cone. And frigates at the inside of cone-shaped formation. This would allow Admiral Hill to easily reinforce weakened parts quickly. Lastly, the carriers would be at the very center, because they were the most vulnerable. Their fighters would be distributed across all sections outside the formation, while concentrating at the tip to knock out large targets like enemy battlecruisers. And so it was set. She would wait until 1900 hours when most of the crew aboard the entire fleet woke up from what she had designated a rest period. And then it would begin. Chapter 4. At exactly 1900 hours, the sirens sounded throughout the entire fleet. All personnel to battle stations. Charlotte had been sleeping in her commander's quarters the past 8 hours. She had gotten plenty of rest. Lights, she said. The lights within her quarters turned on. The room was not large, but it had a private washroom. She walked quickly to the washroom to examine herself. She felt fresh and she looked like it. She carefully took off her t-shirt and trousers and fitted on her orange and green flight suit. It was necessary before she entered the flight prep room and had to put on the final flight suit. She exited her quarters and headed towards the hangar. When she reached there, it was busying with people. The hangar was a large room, not tall by any means. Most of the fighters had been restocked and refueled. They looked menacing with a long magnetic cannon barrel in front. Thrusters stuck in the back and on the sides. The cockpit of each fighter was in the very center, right before the magnetic cannon. Each fighter also was tagged with its own call sign. Charlotte's fighter was designated RW-57 for Red Wing 57. After several affairs in the flight prep room, she was debriefed on her mission, and was in a full flight suit. Half an hour after that, she was in the dark cockpit of her fighter while zooming out into space in formation with the rest of her squad, and the rest of the battle group. Space was silent even though the enemy was clearly displayed on her navigational screen. She tried to remember the plan carefully. She was part of a spearhead force to attack the enemy's most dense lines in the middle. Because she had earned the title Ace of Stars and received promotion to commander, her superiors, that is, Admiral Hill herself, thought it was necessary for her to lead the spearhead. She entered her squad's communication line and spoke into her helmet. "Everybody ready? Everyone understand the plan?" "Yes, Commander," came the replies. The exact plans were simple. Everyone was supposed to double up with a partner in case they were picked up by enemy fighters. If there were light fighters chasing them, they were to engage the enemy fighters, not the capital ships. If they were not picked up, they were to proceed onward towards bombing the capital ships. They stayed in formation as the spearhead of the fleet for half an hour. When it was up, they were very close to the enemy fleet. Beep. Beep. Her navigational screen showed numerous red dots, which were fighters, followed by much larger capital ships behind them. Charlotte gasped. There were so many. She couldn't believe that this is what her debriefing had shown her. Her helmet beeped. "Commander, are we really engaging this?" said someone's wavered voice. Charlotte got a hold of herself. "Hold on, Lieutenant. This isn't what the plan said we'd be facing. Someone must have gotten the readings wrong. Or they changed positions while we moved towards them." "Yes, ma'am. But what do we do?" "I'll message the Admiral for reinforcements. In the meantime, engage." There was no reply. Suddenly, space around her exploded with flak screens. Larger explosions were clearly nuclear. Space around the enemy fighters began exploding too from flak shots fired from friendly capital ships. It was all a mess. Suddenly, her Navy computer beeped as it tracked bogies aiming at her. There were 3 of them. She dialed her partner. "Are you ready?" "Yes, ma'am." "Alpha 9 formation in 3, yelled Charlotte. Charlotte waited for 3 seconds, then suddenly pulled up. On her monitors, her wingmate did the opposite. Each began going in opposite directions. The 3 bogies that had been following them split up. 2 for Charlotte. 1 for her wingmate. At the moment, Charlotte and her wingmate were still out of firing range. Then she pulled back into the direction of the bogies. Her wingmate did the same. The distance began closing. 5, 4, 3. Suddenly, Charlotte veered her fighter away from the 2 bogies aiming at her and followed a path that would intersect the single fighter aiming at her wingmate. Her wingmate did the same, aiming at the 2 bogies chasing her. For a slight second, all 3 bogies appeared clueless. That was all that was needed. Charlotte fired magnetic rounds at her target, and so did her wingmate. Both targets exploded, leaving only 1 enemy fighter remaining. That single fighter made a sudden climb, followed by an abrupt spiral. Charlotte thought it had been too scared to engage her. Then her navigation console beeped. More fighters. Another 2 aimed straight at her. Followed by another 2. There were so many. "Commander? What do we do?" yelled her wingmate. "Commander." "Ah, hell," cried someone's voice, then silence. Charlotte was afraid. Something was wrong. Someone high up had made the mistake of underestimating the enemy forces at this location. But she couldn't abandon her squadron. She had to tell them something. "This is Commander Tai to all pilots," said Charlotte, "fight them. Fight with your lives." "I can't, there's too much," cried someone. Someone else was screaming into the comm channel. "Fight them," yelled Charlotte. "Help will arrive soon." But that wasn't true. She had received no order that help would arrive. Suddenly, cannon rounds shot past her, some so close it streaked across her armor. The sounds vibrated across her hull, giving her a sense of metallic screeching. Instinctively, she pulled upwards. On her monitors, her partner was currently in a twist, chased by 2 fighters. On another monitor, it showed 3 fighters chasing her. She made another twist, followed by another. They were still after her. One was banking around after missing an intended intersection since she pulled up. Another was to her right in parallel. The last was right behind, matching her twist for twist. The one behind her was firing shots that appeared bright white on her view screens. She suddenly braked hard to the right, then went back on the direction she had originally been going. The fighter to her right was now very close in front of her. It tried to turn downward, but Charlotte's cannons pumped rounds of ammunition into its hull. It wavered, then exploded. The enemy that had followed behind her was more agile. It had braked right too, and was still behind her. She quickly devised a plan. She suddenly pulled to the left. Then she cut off her main thrusters and used her side thrusters to her fighter around towards the fighter that was chasing her. But as she was doing so, she noticed on her monitor that another fighter was banking towards her. Damn, she thought. She got rid of that plan. She turned her main thrusters to full and sped in the same direction as the one chasing her. Now it was head-to-head. She fired rounds, and the enemy fired at her. She hit, and the enemy exploded, but so did one of her wings, sending Charlotte's fighter swerving and spinning off course. She tried her best to stabilize. But in the meantime, the second fighter began firing rounds at her out-of-control fighter. They missed. She was able to stabilize her fighter and pushed her main thrusters to the max. Through spiral and spirals, she was able to get him within her sights. She angled her magnetic cannon at him and shot forth deadly rounds of fire into its hull. The enemy exploded into pieces. She barely had time to catch her breath. Her comm channel was crowded with yelling and screaming pilots who being tested to their utmost in combat. She eyed her monitors and saw that 30 of the 80 pilots in her squadron were already dead. Their life signs showed nothing. Another 3 were in critical condition. "Wingmate, you there?" No response. She checked her monitors and saw that her wingmate's ship had been destroyed. That was it. He was gone. There was only one thing left to do. She angled her fighter towards the enemy battleship squadron, and punched the thrusters to full. Chapter 5. Admiral Hill, commander of 1st and 2nd Fleet, eyed coldly at her monitors. The battle bridge of the Excalibur was droning with activity. Below, the captain was shouting for the flak turrets to be realigned. Others, including a medical ensign and surgeon, was treating someone who had been injured by an explosion nearby. The enemy had chosen to reinforce the center of their lines. It was a perfect counter to her wedge formation Admiral Hill had adopted. She was not out of options, yet. She carefully thought about what her fleet should do. Since they had concentrated their forces in the center, that meant their sides were weak. That meant Admiral Hill could pursue an enveloping pincer strategy. She carefully thought out what a strategy would accomplish. An enveloping strategy might work if she had more units, but currently the enemy had plenty more. After several minutes, in which the bridge was full of activity, she came to a conclusion. She inputted the commands into her console, and suddenly a new wave of orders were carried out. Enveloping it was. The flanks of her force would begin spreading out to attack the enemy's weak sides. They would then proceed to surround the enemy. Hill worried that it might make her lines too thin, but it was better than not doing anything. Admiral Hill watched. On her monitors, battleships fought against battleships. Their magnetic cannons rained down fire on each other. Missiles streamed through space and impacted the hulls of numerous warships. A destroyer force was moving at flank speed, while shooting cannon fire into the enemy cruiser line. Although, to a normal observer, it looked like chaos, Admiral Hill could see all the important details. The enemy cruiser line at the rightmost edge of their fleet looked like it was floundering. The line of friendly destroyers at the very center looked strong. Her fighter force in the center was being decimated. Both enemy and friendly battlecruisers in the middle were being pounced by opposing fire. Some were becoming wreckage. Others were still strong. As her lines became thinner, she could weed out the elements that were most likely to collapse if the enemy chose to pressure their forces there. There were no reserves. She had to make do with what she had. Charlotte sat within her little cockpit as space around her exploded with flak. It was flak and more flak. The armor of her fighter had taken days to repair from her previous battle, now it was being shredded once more. Where was the news? There had been no reinforcements. It was her and her alone, amongst thousands of enemies. Apparently, the rest of her squadron was still having dogfights. That, or dead. Currently, there were 3 battlecruisers within range of her magnetic cannon. She fired them. The cannon rounds, however light, would barely dent battlecruiser armor, but it was something at least. She also zigzagged her path, so that it was difficult for the enemy to predict her movements. Her fighter continued to accelerate towards the enemy battlecruisers. The battlecruisers looked like long rectangular shapes, armed with missile turrets and magnetic cannon turrets. When she entered bombing range, she angled her fighter at one of the battlecruisers and released a 10-kiloton nuclear bomb. Cannon shells might not be able to penetrate battlecruiser armor, but nukes could. She only had one. The bomb sprinted away, propelled by a pinpoint target lock system. As the bomb hit, space around her detonated with bright light. Next, Charlotte headed towards another battlecruiser. She knew what to do. Last time, against incredible odds, she had managed to survive. This time she would it, again. She allowed her fighter to pass the battlecruiser. She then managed to get herself in the aft section of one battlecruiser and began slowing down. As she slowed, the flak disappeared, as she was now too close to one of the enemy's battlecruisers for another to fire on it. When came right beside the battlecruiser, she tilted her fighter away from it and punched her thrusters. This made the effect of slowing her fighter down to the same velocity as the capital ship. She then began encircling the ship for protection. But suddenly, something came from the corner of her eye. A fighter? Yes. It shot cannon shells at her, some missed, but some hit. Inside, her damage controls beeped to exhaustion. Something on her plane had been hit. She suddenly accelerated sideways, but the fighter continued following her as she encircled the battlecruiser. It chased her constantly. It was diligent, and captured her move for move. Around a bend, she turned her fighter around and was ready to fire on the enemy fighter that followed her. Moments passed, then it showed up. She fired. It fired at her. Her armor outside exploded. Pain shot through her left leg and a huge gap opened up in her cockpit into space. She could see the void outside, along with her blasted hull. Charlotte screamed. The enemy continued emptying cannon fire into her fighter. The explosions on her hull were deafening to her ears. She screamed and screamed. Her fighter was exploding amidst her eyes. Things were falling away from her hull. The monitors within her cockpit were frozen, dead. She hit the eject button, and suddenly she was hit by the sudden acceleration upward. The hull of her fighter was no longer around her. All she could see was herself and a small resemblance of a cockpit that once was hers. The pain in her left leg was terrorizing, and she knew her suit was venting atmosphere into space. She put her hand where her leg was. She had to stop the atmosphere from venting. There was no air, she couldn't breathe. She was suffocating. "Help," she murmured. Then she passed out. Admiral Hill's plan was working. Inside the bridge, crewmen cheered as more and more enemy capital ships were exploding. On her monitors, she could see how her pincer attack from both sides had weakened the hybrids' flanks. Their flanks, being already weakened by the fact that they had reinforced their center, were now collapsing. The only problem was the hybrid center, which was still strong and sending heavy casualties among friendly combatants near the Hill's own center lines. Somewhere, she saw a friendly battlecruiser explode. Even carriers, which were most protected near the center, had been penetrated by enemy forces and were in critical conditions. But Admiral Hill's plan hinged on the success of her flanks to envelope the enemy. It was only a matter of time. Time, in which, her center lines had to uphold the pounding by strong enemy forces. Minutes passed. Then the enemy lines started breaking one by one. Especially the flanks. Their flanks were hit tremendously hard with fire from her flanks. Overwhelmingly, they were smashed to pieces. Then as they collapsed, her flanks began enveloping the enemy center. They fired their weapons into the enemy center, which was now being attacked from all sides. It was only a matter of time. More minutes passed. The enemy ships in the center turned around and tried to break a hole behind them. The enemy began withdrawing. This hole, which Admiral Hill could not choke because she didn't have enough forces near the enemy's back, became a passageway for escaping enemy ships. There was nothing Hill could do. Little by little, the enemy slipped away, chased by fire from her own ships. Many were destroyed in this fashion. In the end, Admiral Hill counted the statistics. 400 friendly ships lost compared to 800 enemy ships. Half of the friendly losses were frigates and destroyers, while the enemy suffered intense losses like cruisers and even battlecruisers. However, there were heavy losses in her center, which had taken the heaviest beating. Some of her fighter squadrons assigned to the center suffered as much as 80% death rate. Surely, they would be replaced by fresh fighters and their pilots coming from Earth. Chapter 6. Charlotte miraculously found oxygen going back into her lungs. She was breathing, again. She opened her eyes and saw herself floating in space with the bare skeleton of her fighter's cockpit. She looked down at her left leg and saw a stump. It hurt, like hell, but her suit had sealed it from exposure to the void outside. Somewhere else on her monitors, something was beeping. And then a light shone on her. She looked up and was blinded by the beam which flared her crooked beaten face. Her helmet beeped. "Officer Ty, are you okay?" "Yes," said Charlotte. "Get me out of here. And I need medic. I've lost a leg." "Will do, ma'am." Slowly, mechanical arms grabbed her and pulled her out of her cockpit. In her sealed flight suit, she was taken into a chamber in a rescue shuttle, where the cabin was pressurized and a medical bot began analyzing her situation while she was taken to a medbay on board a capital ship. The Second Battle of Delton was another victory for the humans, thought Admiral Hill. The first battle, upon the arrival of the reinforcements, had resulted in the hybrid forces leaving the system. The second battle, as a result of her pincer attack, had resulted in the hybrids retreating with heavy losses. The third battle, she thought, while dozing in her lush admiral's quarters, might be something else entirely different. Her quarters were large, but all Jennifer Hill could see was the ceiling and the low lighting she had set so she could go to sleep. Her thoughts were about what the enemy would do and what she would do in response, as she fell asleep. When Admiral Jennifer Hill woke, it was to the sound of alarms. "Admiral Hill," cried the communication net. "A large hybrid fleet has returned. We need your command, immediately." Admiral Hill was still in her uniform. She hadn't taken it off. She began sprinting out of her room and through the corridors of her flagship. As she passed crewmen, they saluted. She continued running. When she reached the battle bridge, she was greeted by the captain, who told her about the situation. A large hybrid force, bigger than the one that had retreated, was en route to the Delton system. The fleet was waiting for what Admiral Hill would do in response. Would she leave the Delton system? Or would she fight? If so, how? She analyzed the fleet strength of the hybrid force, and compared it to her own. 3,300 blips on the screen, with more entering sensor range. Admiral Hill was aghast. After they had lost 800 and were down to 1,600, somehow they had managed to get another 1,700 starships. "Retreat," said Admiral Hill. "Retreat to Tau Ceti." The captain looked at her and nodded. Orders were sent throughout the bridge, and then sent throughout the fleet. Admiral Hill knew it was the wisest option. Against 3,300 starships, her fleet of 1,700 was no match. Plus, she would not do what the late Admiral Gunter had done, which was not to retreat in the face of overwhelming enemy superiority. But still, 3,300. Thought Admiral Hill as she stood on her platform, eyeing the rest of the busy bridge. How had they gathered such a force? And what was their goal? Were they going to conquer Delton system or were they going to push even further into human territory? Was Tau Ceti, where human high command was located, safe? She had to evacuate the civilians. But there was one problem. There were 1 million civilians on the third planet and the first and second fleet were not an evacuation fleet. They were only supposed to beat the aliens, not evacuate people. They were intended to defeat the aliens in Epsilon Eridani, thus allowing the military ground forces to evacuate using their own equipment. There was no equipment to evacuate civilians, as was the case here in the Delton system. In fact, an invasion of the Delton system had never been planned. Admiral Hill had to think hard. "Captain, order the fleet to dock with the settlements on the third planet and stuff as much passengers aboard as possible." "There isn't enough room," said Captain Strugger. "Who should we give priority to?" Admiral Hill thought about it. "Women and children," she said. "Yes, ma'am." As the orders were sent across the fleet, Admiral Hill wondered, this was one of the times where being a woman did have its benefits. Charlotte was eating sick people's food, the type that was completely liquid, on her hospital bed in the white medbay of the carrier Intrepid. It wasn't her carrier, nor was she happy with the surroundings. Many other injured crewmen were also in the beds around her. Apparently, the carrier Intrepid had taken heavy damages during the second battle. A nurse was attending her. It felt odd, because the nurse was about the same age as Charlotte, 25. However, in terms of accomplishments, Charlotte was now an ace with over 40 total kills in her lifetime. And in terms of education, Charlotte was much more learned. But there was something the nurse had that Charlotte didn't: feminine grace. The nurse moved in calm, neat movements, whereas Charlotte was always hurried and stumbling. "Are you okay, Charlotte Ty?" "Yes," smiled Charlotte. In truth, she was not okay. She had lost a leg and would have to go through operations to get a bionic leg installed. And it still hurt like hell, despite the anesthetics. But at least the rest of her was still intact, as the nurse adjusted Charlotte's supports. How many victories would she get in her total lifetime, before she dies? 80? When will I be able to return to duty? When your new leg is fully integrated with your body and all sensory electrical nodes have been connected. Charlotte sighed and rested her head on the pillow. It would be a long week ahead. The evacuation had been hurried, but when it was done, a full 400,000 civilians had been evacuated. That left still 600,000 civilians consisting of mostly men and elder on the third planet in the Delton system. No sooner had the human fleet left the system's gravity and begun powering their worm space drives did the hybrid fleet launch missiles. These missiles targeted the heavy-density populations on the third planet. Hayden worked as a hydroponics farmer in the southern continent. When the alarms rang out that the missiles were approaching, he simply shrugged. His wife and kids had been evacuated with the human fleet. So he was at least happy. He had been a hydroponics worker for 6 long years. It was not an easy job producing the food for a space civilization, but it had its rewards. Thus, Hayden only flinched when the nuclear wave impacted everything he stood for. It disintegrated him into a burnt corpse, and continued moving out in its deadly radius. Huge nuclear fire waves blew across the countryside and cities that had once been home to a civilization. They left a path of utter destruction. Numerous mushroom clouds filled the sky. In the end, there was nothing but ruin. Chapter 7. Admiral Jennifer Hill's quarters was lofty. It was vast, and with low lighting. Admiral Hill had set purposely for herself to think. She reclined on one of the couches, eyeing the ceiling. The past 5 weeks had weighed on her. For the first week, every single second there was the fear of a hybrid invasion fleet approaching Tau Ceti. Then as the weeks passed, that fear left, leaving only a desolate reminder of weaknesses. Admiral Jennifer Hill was not happy, either. In the time since her retreat, she had been appointed Supreme Fleet Admiral in charge of all fleets, at least all human fleets. High Command was extremely respectful to her, and now she carried the burden of millions more. There was good news, too. Reinforcements from Earth shipyards had accumulated a total of 750 new starships to add to the combined power of the First Fleet. The remnants of Second Fleet had been added to the First as well. Now there was 2,500 total vessels in orbit around Tau Ceti's third moon. A quarter of them were frigates, while another quarter were destroyers, which left a tenth as battlecruisers and carriers. The remaining were normal cruisers. Additions to the fleet's pilot complement were also added. New, fresh recruits from the Flight Academy on Mars Olympus fulfilled all the pilot deaths in the deadly Second Battle of Delton. What Admiral Hill was most afraid of was an attack on the system of Tau Ceti itself. Tau Ceti held 5 million people, most of them centered on the fifth habitable planet. Since the hybrid attack on Delton, Hill had wondered about the likely possibility that an invasion would be launched. Delton, by itself, offered no advantages. Its star had no dark matter. The minerals within the system were not rich in material that could construct starships. However, it did serve as a strategic waypoint for further invasion into human territory. Tau Ceti was technically next. If so, why hadn't the invasion arrived? The enemy held numerical advantage, and that translated into advantages in firepower. Where was the invasion? The admiral lay coldly. 5 days later in the bridge, all of Jennifer Hill's questions were answered. "Worm's pace opening spotted," shouted a lieutenant. The tension on the bridge of the Excalibur suddenly increased a knot. Men who had worked on their stations suddenly sat straighter and more alert. Fear crawled through the atmosphere. Admiral Hill, atop her admiral's platform, scanned the readouts of Worm's pace openings on her computer consoles. It was indeed what she had expected, except this time, there were 4,000 blips on screen. 4,000 ships. That was 700 more than they had 5 weeks ago. What was most evident was the enemy's ability to produce starships. So this was the reason the invasion took so long. The hybrids wanted to wait until their numbers and human numbers were even more unmatched. But what was their goal? Defeat humanity's high command? Prevent humanity from ever encroaching on their expansion forever? It took 2 hours more to find out. Enemy missiles launched. Admiral Hill analyzed the trajectory of those missiles on her monitors. They were heading towards the fifth planet where 5 million people had been. That 5 million had been evacuated weeks in advance, so there was nothing left except infrastructure. She imagined the chaos this would do to Earth. Earth, having 16 billion people, could not be evacuated so easily. If the aliens ever came within bombing distance of Earth, an immeasurable amount of people would die. Admiral Hill now understood the seriousness of her situation. She must win. Otherwise. No, there was no otherwise. That enemy fleet must not get to Earth. They had to be stopped in Tau Ceti. Minutes later, that missile wave struck the surface of the planet, causing huge nuclear explosions that were clearly visible from orbit. All of the surface infrastructure had been eradicated. Now, the hybrid invasion force was moving at high speeds towards Admiral Hill's fleet. The formation they took was that of a concave lens. The outer circles of the lens were closer to Hill's fleet than the inner circles and center. The concave lens was a traditional counter to the spherical formation taken by Hill's fleet. Admiral Hill inputted orders into computer to tell the fleet to organize themselves into a ring. Suddenly, those orders were put into effect and all 2,500 ships began moving. It took minutes. Eventually, Admiral Hill was satisfied. The ring formation was the best counter to a concave lens. Suddenly, the enemy reorganized their patterns into a tight sphere. The formations between the two fleets continued shifting until they came closer to one another, at which point the enemy was reorganizing into the formation of a sphere and Hill's fleet was turning into a concave lens. Hill herself watched as the fleets collided. This is it, she thought. This is where it is all decided. She had her battlecruisers in the center of her fleet. Behind them were the carriers. Surrounding the battlecruisers were a ring of smaller cruisers, followed by a ring of destroyers and frigates. The enemy, too, had battlecruiser at the frontal tip of their sphere, followed by rings of smaller ships around. The very center of their sphere were their carriers. Carriers were by far the weakest units in terms of armor, but they were able to supply fighters that were very strong in large numbers against all other unit types at short range. Battlecruisers had the highest armor and were the hardest to take down, and they had the second highest firepower. Other smaller ships had lower armor and lesser firepower. Thus, when the two fleets collided, Admiral Hill watched carefully as each unit fired their magnetic cannons and missiles at the other fleet according to the targeting priorities she gave. She also ordered the fighters to be launched. The alarm sounded throughout the carrier. Charlotte strapped herself into her new fighter's dark cockpit and closed her eyes. She thought of a calm place she always thought of before each battle. It was her home on Mars. Not the dorm in Mars Olympus, but her small tenant apartment deep underground where her parents lived. She had a sister, too, who was 5 years younger than her. The controller, a woman, spoke. Red Wing -57, you have a go. Launch. Go. Go. She opened her eyes and fired up the main thrusters. She pushed her fighter out to space. Her visual monitor showed the carrier falling quickly behind her, becoming smaller and smaller. Her orders were this: she was to command 4 squadrons of 50 fighters and lead them into the heart of the enemy, and destroy their carriers. Most of the 200 pilots were new to replace the 70% death ratio in pilots from the last battle. Since she was the highest-ranking survivor, she was allowed to lead all 4 squadrons from her carrier. Suddenly, her electronics picked up explosive flak around her. It was coming from the enemy battlecruisers in front. Every once in a while, she could hear thuds on her armor. On her squadron monitors, she could see fighters falling to the flak. Already, 3 of the 200 fighters were dead. Also on her monitors were the stream of missiles being exchanged between the two fleets. Cannon rounds were also visible as bright yellow darts. By the time she passed the enemy's battlecruiser line and into the smaller cruiser line, she had already lost 10 pilots to flak. Around her, enemy battlecruisers were exploding by the sudden dead-on hits of missiles and cannon shells. The enemy cruiser layer were also firing flak at her squadrons. "Keep on zigzagging," she said to all her pilots. "Yes, ma'am," they replied. Suddenly, up ahead, numerous blips showed on her monitors. They were enemy fighters launched by enemy carriers. "Heads up, guys," yelled Charlotte. "Enemy fighters ahead, do what I told you. Good luck." What she had told them was to split into groups of 4 and fight the enemy fighters, and also to use all the tactics they had learned in flight school. Cannon shells streamed past her on her monitors. She searched for the culprit and aimed her barrel at him. She fired. Somewhere, far away, there was an explosion. Charlotte was surprised. She had hit from this distance. "Enemy fighter on my tail," said someone. She saw where that came from and shot spews at the enemy fighter. Another explosion. As an ace, she was getting accurate. Suddenly, shells streamed past her and by instinct she turned upwards and flipped. She then did another turn and another. Finally, she found her target and fired. Another explosive kill. Admiral Hill watched in the main bridge as 2,000 of her fighters launched by her carriers were engaging enemy fighters. Some had passed through the enemy fighter defenses and were proceeding towards attacking the enemy carriers as ordered. She was losing tons of fighters each second. It was obvious that it was going to be likely another lethal 70% death ratio scenario for pilots as it had been in the past battle. On her monitors, she also saw how the frontline units of her fleet had intercrossed frontline units of the enemy fleet. Together, battlecruisers were within ramming distance of each other. But she did not order them to ram, she needed her numbers more than the enemy needed theirs. Her fleet was now 2,400. The enemy was still 3,900. Admiral Hill continued sending orders to her fleet. She forced units that had been heavily damaged to move back and fire at long range, while also telling units to target those enemy units that were most likely going to attack her damaged units and those that were the most weak. The monitors showed everything, including ships within her fleet that were exploding with all hands lost. There was nothing Hill could do for them. This was war. Charlotte rotated her fighter and zigzagged out of way of the enemy fighter's cannon fire just as her shells hit the enemy and he exploded. It had been like that for hours. Eventually, Her fighters had outwitted and outmaneuvered enemy fighters until the remaining enemy fighters were retreating. Out of the 200 fighters in her squadrons, there were only 60 left. They had killed 300 enemy fighters total. It was all because of their training in flight school. "All right, guys. Let's follow our orders and blow those carriers," said Charlotte. "Yes, ma'am," came the replies. "Go. Go." Along with chasing the enemy fighters that were retreating, Charlotte's squadrons headed towards the carriers. When they got within the range of their flak, the space around them began exploding, again. "One down. No, two," thought Charlotte, as she looked at her squadron monitors. By the time they got within bombing range of the carriers, they were down to 54 fighters. "Unload your nukes. Give them hell," yelled Charlotte. Suddenly, all 54 fighters aimed carefully at their carrier targets and unleashed their nuke bombs. The bombs left trails of small rocket propellant in their midst. Some were shot by flak and exploded before they reached their targets, but most of them did hit. The resulting explosions showed on Charlotte's monitors. Numerous enemy carriers were heavily damaged by the nukes. They would be inoperable. Others blew up, spewing hot oxygen out into the void. The enemy fighters that were returning to their carriers suddenly found out that there were no carriers left. They turned around and headed towards Charlotte's squadron. "Let's show them what we got." Chapter 8. It was amazing. Out of the 2,000 fighters launched against the enemy, only 800 were left. But those 800 dealt horrific damage to enemy's carrier line, almost completely annihilating. Admiral Hill watched as they began engaging the retreating enemy fighters, again. Someone who had taught the pilots, even the green ones, at Mount Olympus, knew exactly what to teach. As a result, her fleet's fighters were terrifying to the enemy. Atop her admiral's platform, Admiral Hill watched as even more battlecruisers from both fleets were gunned down by fire. Lesser starships were also falling. Of her fleet, 200 frigates had already been destroyed. 100 cruisers. 20 battlecruisers. Hill once again ordered another charge by her fleet to attack those ships of the enemy that were retreating. She also ordered her fleet to target those that were attacking her own damaged ships. But even with her ferocious command, she was still losing. She was suffering higher losses. That was because of the great numbers inequality. Hill stared calmly at her monitors, hoping. An hour later, Admiral Hill ordered her fighters to begin attacking the center area of the enemy fleet, which was mostly battlecruisers and smaller cruisers. As a result, all 700 fighters started heading towards the enemy center. The enemy flak was all around Charlotte. But besides the flak, the capital ships of the enemy had no weapon against fighters. Their cannons were much too large and fired too infrequently to be a danger against small fighters. Inside her dark cockpit, Charlotte could see the enemy cruisers and battlecruisers on her monitor. She aimed her cannon at them and pumped shells in their direction. It was easy to hit, as the enemy capital ships loomed large. Admiral Hill watched in her admiral's platform as her fighters fired at the enemy. Although weak themselves, in numbers, even their weak cannon rounds dented the enemy capital ship's armor and shredded them. As a result, minutes later, Admiral Hill saw an opportunity she hadn't expected. The enemy battlecruiser and cruisers were falling at a much faster pace. Admiral Hill ordered the frigates and destroyers in her outer ring to condense near her fleet's center. Once they did that, she ordered them to begin attacking the enemy's already weakened center. The result was magnificent. The enemy center collapsed. Enemy capital ships in those areas were utterly destroyed. She then ordered all her ships, including the damaged ones, to charge at the enemy's center. As a result of that, nothing within the enemy's center survived her fleet's charge. Then she inputted commands that ordered her fleet to charge at one of the enemy fleet's sides. An hour later, Hill saw how the enemy was responding. Instead of letting its fleet be destroyed by her condensed formations, it had tried to condense itself as well. Its fleet, which had been in concave lens, was now converging into a dense sphere. So was Hill's fleet. But the enemy no longer had any battlecruisers. Thoughts ripped through Jennifer Hill's mind. Thoughts of victory. Without battlecruisers, the enemy fleet could not deliver the type of damage necessary to defeat Hill's fleet even with their greater numbers. Admiral Hill smiled. Earth had been saved. For the next several hours, she watched as the enemy sustained damage at a much higher pace than Hill's fleet. This was due to the attacks done by Hill's surviving fighter squadrons, as well as her battlecruisers that pummeled the enemy's smaller starships. In the end, 2,800 enemy starships were destroyed before the enemy retreated back to Delton system. Out of 2,500 starships, 1,000 starships of the friendly forces had been destroyed. Over 50% of pilots had been killed as well, but it was much less than before. The Battle of Tau Ceti was the turning point in the war between humanity and the race known as the hybrids. There were many battles after that, including the Second Battle of Tau Ceti, the Third Battle of Delton, and the Third Battle of Epsilon Eridani. Of particular focus is the ingenuity of Fleet Admiral Jennifer Hill's usage of fighters. Despite the heavy losses of pilots in each battle, they were made up by new fresh recruits from flight school on Mars Olympus. Of even more particular notice was Flight Commander Charlotte Ty, who, in her 8th battle, attained the record of any fighter pilot to achieve 100 kills. 4 weeks after the First Battle of Tau Ceti, Mirabelle Travi was rescued. For the first time, she saw the stars above the surface. In them, she saw hope. The end.